Welcome back, everyone. This is part 3 of our FantasyLabs NHL division preview shows, where we're going to highlight each team from every division going into the 2017-2018 season. I'm your host, Joel Holka, joined, as always, by Sean Newsham. You can find him on Twitter at PSUFans2. Sean, how we doing, man?
Not too bad. Ready to wrap up these previews here, go through the Western Conference and run through these tonight. So hopefully the ones we did last night or the other day worked well. So hopefully tonight we can just wrap some up and get some good info going into the season.
Yeah, a good time of the year just to come talk some hockey with you guys. Been really looking forward to that. Also joining us today, Ryan Sheppard. He is at DongShow DFS on Twitter. But yeah, let's not waste any time, guys. Let's jump right into the Western Conference. We're going to start in the Central Division with the Chicago Blackhawks. So I think it's pretty obvious that they weren't expecting to get bounced out of the first round. They definitely weren't expecting to be swept in the first round. Chicago got pretty aggressive this offseason with a few blockbuster trades. They traded away Nicholas Hjalmarsson, who's won 3 cups with the Blackhawks. He's now a member of the Arizona Coyotes. And then they obviously traded Anton Panarin, which we talked about quite a bit in the last show. But, Sean, is there anyone else as far as the transactions that really stands out? They've definitely made a few moves and brought a couple guys back.
Yeah, their entire defensive core is going to be overhauled a bit this year because they lost people like Brian Campbell, Hjalmarsson, Johnny Oduya, Trevor Van Riemsdyk. So you're going to look at a lot of people coming in on both ends of the ice, honestly. Marian Hossa is out this year. He's got a skin condition that is causing him to miss the season. So there's a lot of people coming in. You have Patrick Sharp coming in. You have Brandon Saad coming in. So like we talked about last night with Panarin, these are guys that are coming in that are familiar with the Chicago Blackhawks and the players around them. So I really think that they're going to come in and mesh well because they already are familiar with the system and the players they're coming in to play with. So it definitely is a spot where these guys could come in and just get a lot of firepower going forward for this season. Yeah,
Ryan, I just wanted to ask you, do you think they made too many changes? Obviously, a couple of them were necessary. You mentioned Marian Hossa, but was there too many changes? I mean, we're going to have Saad back, Patrick Sharp back, the losses on D. Do you think it was too much?
Yeah, it almost looks like they're just trying to bring back the team that won them the cups. The problem is a guy like Patrick Sharp is, almost 36 years old. He was pretty bad last year. He doesn't have the same kind of firepower. You look at their defense core, and it doesn't look anything like it did before. Obviously, you have Keith and Seabrook, but other than that, there's no more returning guys. We talked about it in the Carolina preview. I think the loss of Scott Darling is going to be extremely underrated. I mean, he played 32 games last year, and his numbers were actually better than Corey Crawford's. So, I mean, they were counting on him. Obviously, he was a backup, but they were counting on him for a lot of starts. And I don't think, backup goalies are a little bit underrated. And if they're not going to be starting Crawford 65 games again, then I don't know what they're going to do. Obviously, Crawford's awesome. But, I mean, right now I think they got Anton Forsberg back there, and they can't expect him to be starting more than 15, 20 games.
Yeah, I mean, it takes a lot of pressure off when you know you have that good number 2 goaltender, similar to what Pittsburgh had last year. So both these teams are going to be going in with just one guy pretty much to carry the load. We'll see. I think what's interesting is hopefully we'll see Saad play with Taves again, because Taves he's not really struggled, but he's failed to reach 60 points in each of the last 2 seasons. And in both the last 2 playoffs, he's only got 1 goal. So I think it's interesting. We'll see if Taves can kind of turn things around. Obviously, he does a lot more on the defensive side of the puck as well. Sean, you mentioned Marian Hossa. Who do you think is going to be the guy that kind of steps up for them? I mean, talk about defensive forwards. Hossa is probably one of the best in the game.
Yeah, I mean, defensively, they're definitely going to struggle because they re-brought in Patrick Sharp and some of the guys like Ryan alluded to, he's a bit older. The biggest question mark for me for this team and the biggest X factor is going to be Alex DeBrincat. Living in Erie and being very familiar with the team, DeBrincat's a really talented hockey player. And he's a small guy, but he's quick, can put the puck in the back of the net. And really is going to be interesting to me to find out who he plays with this year, because if DeBrincat somehow finds his way onto one of the top lines, which is definitely possible based on how the last couple of years have panned out, and if someone like Patrick Sharp can't fill in on that second line with Kane, you could see someone like Alex DeBrincat go up there and be a rookie and an impact player and really perform well for them if given the minutes.
Yeah, I'm interested to see a guy like Nick Schmaltz as well. He's someone that just dominated at North Dakota and then kind of played right alongside Patrick Kane for a good part of last year. Someone that we were really targeting DFS because he's just one of those guys that they just didn't raise his price for so long, and he was playing with such talented players. Either of you guys, you have anything more on the Blackhawks? It's definitely going to be a different feel, but I guess a little bit familiar as well.
Yeah, it just looks like they're going to be having to rely a lot more on some of their younger forwards, like Sean alluded to, DeBrincat, Nick Schmaltz, even Brandon Saad. Like, he's been in the league for 5 years, but he still hasn't even turned 25. Like, he's still young but established player, and they're going to be leaning on these guys a lot more with people like Panarin getting traded, Hossa, well, I guess not retiring, being on the IR. That it's going to be a very different looking Blackhawks team.
Yeah, definitely. Sean, you got anything left for the Blackhawks, or do you want to move on?
No, yeah, we can head on. I think they're going to be an interesting team, though, especially to see how things shake out, because we really have no idea of how they're going to fan out the roster as the season moves along.
Yeah, moving from a team that was extremely competitive to a team that was not so competitive, the Colorado Avalanche. They had just 22 wins last year, 48 points, 30th in the league in scoring. They were scoring 2 goals per game, and they were allowing just over 3. So I think that's going to be the biggest change for them this year. Hopefully they can give up a few less goals, but goal scoring has really been an issue. They made a few significant moves. They also signed Jonathan Bernier to a 1-year contract. So I think it's going to be hopefully a better year for the Avalanche, but I guess there's still a lot of room for improvement. So is there anything that stands out, Sean? I know you're looking right at the transactions.
Yeah, so here's a pet peeve of mine in the NHL and just sports in general. If you are a bad team, let young players make mistakes and learn. Someone like Nail Yakupov was the #1 overall pick in the league. And I'm not saying Nail Yakupov is a good player, because he's clearly not, and he has massive defensive inadequacies. However, his offensive game is very, very skilled, because he was the #1 draft pick in the NHL. You don't get that without being a very good offensive player. So a team like Edmonton in the past, when Yakupov was on their team and they were a terrible team, why is Yakupov not getting minutes, even if they're not great, because he has defensive leaks? Because there's no reason not to be playing him. So anyways, Colorado brought him in. Colorado could be a very poor team yet again this year, and they brought in someone like Nail Yakupov. Let the kid go out there and skate and see what he can do offensively. The worst thing that's going to happen is Yakupov's going to put up points if you give him minutes, because he's a good offensive player, and you can drive up a trade chip from him, because people are going to be like, oh, this guy can score at the NHL level, or he can play make at the NHL level. There's no downside to letting someone like that go out and get some run for you. So they brought him in, and it'll be interesting to see if maybe he can get some run for this team at points during the year and see what could happen with him.
Yeah, he hasn't proven a lot yet, but the skill set's definitely there. Some of their other forwards, they have so much talent. Matt Duchene, Landeskog, McKinnon, but this team was shut out 12 times last year. That was the most in its history. So, Ryan, who do you think is going to be the one that kind of carries the load on offense? Do you think it's going to be one of those guys I mentioned?
It's funny. Yakupov was the first guy I was going to want to mention, so I won't really go into too much detail. Not that I think he's going to necessarily carry the load, but I think it's a good spot for a guy like Landeskog and Nathan McKinnon to kind of bounce back. We touched on it a bit before, but Colorado's another team that doesn't have much center depth and is trying to trade away a center. There's rumors everywhere about Matt Duchene. Obviously, they struggle to score goals, but he's coming off one of his worst seasons of his career. You're going to be selling him at the absolute lowest point possible. It just seems like at this point, I know the relationship is probably not great, but you need him to get his value back up there. The forwards are, for the most part, I guess other than Landeskog, they are all very offensively minded. I think that might be part of what hurt them, is the fact that like, obviously they did have trouble scoring goals, but they also could not keep the puck out of the net. Like, they were just as bad on the back end. Like, it's when, like, obviously Tyson Barrie's, he also had a down year. Everybody had a down year. I think Nathan McKinnon's 22 years old. He's a guy that I look to have a very big rebound year. I still expect Colorado to be one of the worst teams in the league, but I don't see why a lot of these guys can't put up some offensive numbers that they have in the past when they were still poor a couple of years ago.
Yeah, that's the question. I mean, you mentioned the defense. Has it really improved at all? Like, I mean, they're a team that gave up so many goals last year, but they didn't really make a significant move. So, yeah, I think it's going to be something to watch. Hopefully they can kind of keep the puck out of the net a little bit more. But as far as that, like Simeon Varlamov, is he going to be able to stay healthy this year, Sean? That was such a big deal.
He's had issues throughout his whole career. It's definitely a question mark. Their defense is so poor in front of them. I mean, they really didn't do anything. I mean, they drafted Cale Maker, who I don't know if Ryan is as intrigued by him as I am, but the competition level that Maker played against in junior, whatever the league was he was in, the junior B, tier 2, whatever it was, up in Brooks, Alberta, is just not a strong league. But all the rumors and all the talk about Cale Maker is that he has the potential to become a massive two-way force when he gets up to the pros. So I wish there was a chance he was going to be on the roster this year, but he's going to be playing college hockey this year, I believe. But they really didn't address much on their team. And something we talked about quickly yesterday with Ryan O'Reilly in Buffalo and how underrated he is. Just look at what happened to this Colorado team when Ryan O'Reilly left. When Ryan O'Reilly was there, they outperformed what they should have done, and they were making the playoffs, and they were a very strong team. All they did pretty much was take Ryan O'Reilly off the roster, and this became one of the worst teams in the league. So that just goes to show how underrated he is. But this team is – the problem with this team is when we look at teams like New Jersey that we talked about the other day, they have a very massive talent void that they just can't really deal with compared to the other teams in the league. Colorado doesn't have that. Colorado has a lot of talented players. They just can't finish putting it together. And then you have someone like Matt Duchene. Matt Duchene's been rumored to be traded for longer than he's in the league. The guy's been rumored on the trade market for the last 3 years, and they need to either move him on, but like Ryan said, right now it's the lowest point in his career to trade him. So you need to put him out there, and you need to get these guys going again, and you need to drive up some trade value on them because you can't sell them at their lowest point because they're still young and talented players.
Yeah, one guy I want to throw out there as far as young players, Tyson Jost out of North Dakota last year, but he's probably the best forward to come out of the Penticton V's organization since Ryan Johansson, maybe Bo Bennett, one of those guys. But he's a pretty impressive player, first-round pick in the 2016 draft. So I think Yost is going to be really interesting to watch. Is there anyone else you really want to talk about, Ryan, before we move on?
Just, I guess another young guy I'd be interested in is Mikko Rantanen. He was the only guy on their team that put up 20 goals last year, and it was really just it was part of a hot streak to end the year. So we'll see if he can carry that over and take the next step forward this year. Other than that, I'm just looking for guys that have been proven to put up points to kind of rebound and hopefully get back to where they were.
Yeah, good stuff. The Dallas Stars is who we're going to move on to next. They're probably one of the most active teams this offseason. They had a pretty disappointing 2016 season. They did not qualify for the playoffs for the second time in 3 years. They fired Lindy Ruff. They ended up bringing back Ken Hitchcock, who obviously won a Stanley Cup there in 1999. Hitchcock's more of like a defensive-oriented coach, if I remember correctly. Scott, do you think this team is going to be a little bit more defensive than Hitchcock, or do you think that there's still some guys who'll be able to target?
It's hard to get less defensive, I guess. They have massive issues. One of my favorite things to talk about is John Klingberg. Mm-hmm. John Klingberg is like the one-man shorthanded breakaway because he just skates up the ice on power plays and just drop passes to nobody without having any clue what's going on. And he has some of the worst awareness on the power play of all time. So you basically watch their game, and it's like, someone scored a shorthanded goal against Dallas again. So they had some issues, and they sent some people out, but they brought in a lot of people. But honestly, their offensive game should be fantastic again. I really like Radulov. I really think he could flourish even more than what he did last year with the guys he's going to skate this year. So it's definitely a situation where they brought in someone like Martin Hanzal. Martin Hanzal's a really good face-off man. So down the middle, they're really strong again, and it's just a matter of their back end being really weak. And it's going to be hard for them to perform all year when your back end consists of a bunch of young guys that are very raw and are more offensive-minded than they are defensive-minded. So it's going to be interesting to see how that goes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a big part of it last year was how poor they were on the penalty kill. They were last in the NHL, 73.9%. So That's the worst since 1993. So that was like historically bad penalty kill last year, which should be improved under Hitchcock, you would think. But I think what you're talking about with Hansel makes a lot of sense. They have a ton of centers, but they're going to need someone to play the wing as well. So who do you think is going to play with Sagan, Ryan? We'll go to you. Do you think that do you think Hansel has the potential even to move to the wing, or do you think they'll keep him kind of in that same role?
I think they should keep him in the same third line role. I don't think he has the offensive. Like, I know he's put up points, but I think that was more of just because he was getting the minutes when he was in Arizona. I think I like him as a third line center. I think they should kind of set their top six in pairs and have Ben and Spezza playing together and Sagan and Radulov playing together. If they try to load up their top line, as much offense as they have, I think their second line will be a little bit too weak to match up. One thing that we touched on with Carlson is Mark Mathot, and right now he looks like he's going to be slated to play with John Klingberg. So, I mean, it might let Klingberg do what he likes to do, and if Mathot can cover him, then we could see Klingberg put up another offensive season that, without having the blemishes defensively be so well known. I really think that Hitchcock is going to help this team defensively, and I actually expect Ben Bishop to have a really big season. Hitchcock is known to just come in and just play, a very boring defensive game. And despite their offensive talent, I really do think that's going to help their back end and maybe mask some of the holes that they do have and potentially let some of their young guys grow.
Yeah, really good analysis there. Sean, anything to add as far as the decor? We haven't touched on that much outside of that top pairing, but it's definitely interesting after those first two guys.
Yeah, I mean, they're going to need someone like Julius Honka or Esa Lindell or someone like that to step up. The problem is none of these guys are going to be defensive lockdown players. So Mark Mathot is going to be the most important player on their team this year because he's going to have to – if he can allow John Klingberg to do what Erik Karlsson did – now, granted, you're never going to get that output out of him because he's not as good of a player as Erik Karlsson at this point in his career, or maybe most likely ever. But if Mathot can do that, and Mathot can give them a guy who can lock down teams for 25 minutes and play that defensive role, it at least alleviates a lot of the pressure that you have on the other guys, which is a massive need for them because you look down their defensive roster and it's a bunch of younger guys that are more known for offensive abilities than they are for defensive abilities.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. This team's super interesting just because how they were pretty good offensively last year, but one of the worst defensive teams in the league. We'll see if their philosophy kind of changes a little bit this year. As far as the defensive philosophy, at least in the past, the Minnesota Wild is the next team we're going to talk about. They made the playoffs in each of the past 5 seasons, but they haven't made it past the second round. So they're still trying to get over the hump. They have seemingly a roster full of like second or third line forwards, but no one that's really been able to help them get over the hump. So I think it's really interesting that they had kind of a record season last year, and then they were eliminated in the first round. We know all about the Blackhawks' history with them in the playoffs. But what stands out most to you with the Wild? We'll start with you, Sean.
Yeah, they brought in a couple guys from Buffalo. So they brought in Tyler Ennis and they brought in Marcus Foligno. The problem is they didn't really bring in tons of needle movers, I guess, on the offensive end or the defensive end. Martin Hansel left. I know he only spent about a half a season there, but he was pretty important to them. And then you're going to have to look at younger guys like Charlie Coyle continuing to step up. And then Joel Eriksson Ek should get a more prominent role with the team this year. I know he's been an exciting player for them, and he's gotten a couple sniffs of the big league. So it'll be interesting to see what he can go out there and do going into this season.
Yeah, I think Eriksson Ek could kind of help them with their depth at center. We talked about how they lost Martin Hansel and then also Erik Haula to the Golden Knights in the expansion draft. So I think that's going to be interesting. So which of these players kind of need to step up to you, Ryan, when you're looking at a guy like Mikko Koivu, Zach Parise, Ryan Suter, Eric Stahl? Like, who do you think is the one that really needs to step up for this team to take the next step?
I don't know if it's necessarily step up. I think just Mikael Granlund has to continue doing what he did last year. He took a huge leap, upping his career high point total by 25 points. And I think he needs to really stay at that level and be their, I guess, franchise forward at this point. He is their best offensive player, and I think he needs to, I wouldn't necessarily take the next step, but he needs to at least come close to repeating and getting 65-plus points again for this team to really continue to take steps. I definitely like the depth of their forward, and I do kind of like the way this team's built. They do have three very balanced scoring lines. I don't feel any is much weaker than the other, and then their fourth line, it's got some offensive ability as well. Like, it's not just some plugging fourth line that you throw out there for 8 minutes a game. It's a line that can probably play out 10, 11, 12 minutes. And I think that's something that will really help this team, is that their depth forwards on their third and fourth line can really outmatch a lot of other teams in the Western Conference.
Yeah, they've got a lot of guys that just really compete, like a lot of guys that are willing to kind of play a role. Charlie Coyle obviously had a better offensive year last year. Foligno, I mean, he's a guy that he was fifth in the league in hits last season, so he's a guy that's going to be running around out there. I think Mike Riley is really interesting on the back end. Sean, I remember we talked about him a little bit last year. He's a guy that played for the Gophers. Unbelievable skater. He's someone that if he kind of was thrust into a power play role, I think he'd be someone that we could target early in the season at a low price.
Yeah, I mean, that Ryan sort of mentioned it. This probably is the deepest team in the entire NHL, if you include both the forwards and the defensemen. You look up and down the roster and you see a bunch of players that are at least adequate players and probably playing both. Once you remove past the top line, you probably get down to the second line. You're like, okay, these guys are solid second line. You get to the third and fourth line, and then you get to like the second and third defensive pairing, and you realize that these are all guys that probably could be playing up a line or like are very solid, if not adequate, at the line above them. So when you look through this entire roster, their depth is unreal. So it might be a situation, though, where what happens is because their lines are so balanced and they are very deep, they don't end up running guys 20 minutes a night on the offensive end. And you might see a guy like Ryan Suter take a minutes drop back on the back end because he doesn't need to play as many minutes because they have adequate enough complementary pieces. So it's definitely something to monitor to see how these guys are getting along as the season goes along in terms of minutes played.
Yeah, we'll see if they can keep Devin Dubnyk a little bit more fresh this year. He had kind of an up and down season, but it was pretty strong for them in the playoffs. I mean, there wasn't much they could do against the Blues. They just couldn't score goals. That was the problem in that series. So I think they're a pretty interesting team. Let's keep this moving. The Nashville Predators coming off, obviously, their run to the Stanley Cup final last year. I think it's kind of just the challenge now to see what they can do to kind of get back to that point. They lost in 6 games to Pittsburgh, but they have a really young core of forwards, a couple experienced mobile defensemen. Really like Nashville. It's a team, I don't remember if it was on DraftKings or FanDuel last year, Sean, but it was one that we were just like constantly attacking because they were underpriced for a good month or so last year. So what do you think about Nick Bonino in particular? We talked about a little bit last year, but I'll bring that one to you, Ryan. What are your thoughts on Nick Bonino? You think he can actually be an offensive threat for this team, or is he going to be more of like a third, second-line center for kind of defensive purposes?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I'm pretty sure he's going to be slated in on the second line with Mike Fisher retiring and everything. He's put up points before, and I think he's capable of putting up, 45-ish points in this kind of system. But I think he will be looked at more defensively, even if he's playing on the second line. They'll probably look to match him up with a couple offensive players, and he can be, kind of the defensive rock on that line. I think he can be all right. The one thing that is interesting is they signed Ryan Johansson to an $8 million deal, which I think is a little high. And then they got Victor Arvidsson to a $4.25 million deal, which is a pretty sweetheart deal. I think that those two things balance each other out, and their top line is, if they stack it up like they have with Forsberg, Johansson, and Arvidsson, it's going to be one of the best lines in the NHL. And I think that was the line that was underpriced, at least on DraftKings for a lot of the year, because I remember using it constantly, and I could always pair them up with another very talented line. Their defense is going to be interesting. PK Subban didn't have the best year for him last year, but I think he's one of the more underrated defensemen in the NHL. He always gets a lot of flack, and I think a lot of that has to do with just his personality and the way he is in the media. But I mean, his possession numbers are constantly phenomenal. And I think with his second year in Nashville, he's kind of over getting traded from Montreal. I think he can really settle down and be the awesome defenseman that I've seen him be throughout his career.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. Sean, what do you think about the Johansson contract? $64 million over 8 years.
It's a bit high, but you're paying for a young centerman. So it's something you have to do. And with Ryan saying, like, Arvidsson deal is a really solid deal, and they sort of balance each other out to two really solid deals if you look at it. I think you have to pay for someone like that going into the season because you don't find young, talented centers growing on trees. But apparently in some of the teams in the NHL, that is the case because they want to all trade them. So anyways, I think that it's a fine deal. I don't have too big of an issue with it. I would have liked to see it a little bit less, but it seems like a lot of the players in the NHL, like that type of caliber, are all getting 8-year deals, which just seems very lengthy to me at this point. And then they all are getting them for about that type of term. So I think it's solid. They're going to be missing Ryan Ellis for at least the first couple months of the season, which will be a decent issue for them. They brought in Alexei Emelin from Montreal, and he'll probably fill the role for Ryan Ellis over the first couple months of the season. But you look at Nashville, and Nashville's built from the back forward. The defense, that top two pairings last year were the best two pairings in the NHL when you combine them. They both are super solid. When you have Roman Josi and you have Subban, I expect Subban to bounce back this year. I think part of what the hate is with PK Subban is what Ryan said, is his personality. People don't like it. I personally love PK Subban. I think that over the next 7-8 years or whatever, Montreal is going to massively regret the day where they made that trade and brought in Shea Weber, who's a great player, but they're going to get the back end of Shea Weber's career, where Nashville is going to get the prime of PK Subban. So I look to him to rebound this year, and I think they're going to be a very strong team again, even though they did lose some pieces and have to retool a little bit. But the Nick Bonino signing, bring him in, should massively help them in that aspect.
Yeah, one of the pieces they did lose was James Neal in the expansion draft. Not sure how much of a loss it is, at least in the locker room, but he's definitely going to be missed as far as his goal-scoring ability. Ryan, who do you think is going to be able to stand up or step up for James Neal?
I think the one guy they're going to probably be looking to is Kevin Fiala. I know he got hurt last season, and he was expected last year to kind of step into a top 6, maybe top 9 role and really put up some offensive numbers. So I think this year he's most likely going to be slotted on the second line with Nick Bonino, assuming they load up the top line. And he's definitely going to be someone that they're going to be looking to kind of help pitch in with some of the loss from James Neal. And I think, Sean made a good point about Ryan Ellis being out for, I think, 3 or 4 months or whatever it is, because they were loading up their top 2 pairing and just having their third pair play like 10 minutes a game. And now they're most likely going to have to balance it out across all 3 pairings. And that's going to be it's going to be interesting to see how they do that. The other thing I wanted to touch on was the goaltending. UC Saros looked pretty good last year, but everyone remembers Pekka Rinne in the playoffs. But the thing is, his numbers were pretty inflated by that first-round sweep against the Blackhawks. If you look at his per-round statistics, he declined every single round. And I'm curious to see how he plays this year, because he's almost 35 years old. He's getting up there, and he did not look that great in the regular season. And UC Saros I wouldn't say he was pushing him, but he was putting up pretty solid numbers, and it might end up being more of a 45-37 split this year than Pekka Rinne being the bona fide starter.
Yeah, Saros has spent a little bit of time in the American League as well. He's not a big goaltender. That's something you'll notice right away about him, especially in comparison to who he's been backing up. But Sean, anything else with this team before we move on? I think we've pretty much touched on most of it.
Yeah, no, that's pretty much it with Nashville. I definitely want to see with Pekka Rinne, because he is getting up there in age, and I think it's something they need to start getting Saros some more time. And it's definitely something a bit of a worry for Nashville, because Pekka Rinne's stats at parts last year were pretty subpar.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. Moving on to the St. Louis Blues. They're a team that's been pretty consistent over the last couple of years. They made the Western Conference Final in 2016, and they've got just a really young core group. And then some guys are still trying to develop as well. So I think this is a really interesting team. Sean, who stands out from the transactions?
The biggest transaction they have is Braden Shen. They brought in Braden Shen. They traded Jordy Laterra off to Philly for him. And it's going to be very interesting because there's a decent possibility he gets thrust up onto the top line with like Jaden Shorts and Tarasenko on the wings. And if that's the case, he's going to have to step up. I've always been a Shen fan, but he's never really done exactly what I would expect for him to do all the time. So he's definitely someone that's going to have to come in and be successful for St. Louis in order for them to go back and make a deep run to the playoffs, because you look through the bottom part of their roster, they have some younger guys coming up. Robbie Fabry is going to be coming back off of the injury. Vladimir Sobotka is going to actually get a full season with them this year, so it's going to be interesting to see what happens with him. So you're going to have to see what guys like Ivan Barbashev can come in and do for them. And then the back end, I know they just re-signed Colton Parayko. They give him some money. So they should be solid again, but it's definitely some question marks, especially at the top end with Braden Shen.
Yeah, I think it's the Braden Shen signing was interesting. I think Robbie Fabry is one of the ones that I want to watch early in the season. I mean, he had 29 points last year before tearing his ACL. But I think he's a guy that can give them a bit of a scoring boost. What do you think of Fabry, Ryan?
Actually, it was announced this afternoon that he's out for the season.
Oh, yikes.
Awesome.
So that's
perfect.
I'll keep you around, Ryan.
Yeah, so that's obviously going to hurt their team. His knee injury, he's actually going to be out for the season. It was just announced today, which is obviously unfortunate. They've got Berglund out till December, which is going to hurt their center depth. Bouwmeester's hurt right now. They do have a lot of injuries, which is might get them out to a slow start to begin the season. But once guys like Berglund and Bouwmeester come back, it's really going to shore up their depth. Berglund, his first couple years in the NHL, he was putting up some offensive numbers, but he really settled into the third line, more of a defensive player. I think the acquisition of Braden Shen was awesome. I mean, I felt like Jordy Laterra was kind of the anchor in a bad way when he was playing with Tarasenko and Schwartz. I hated that he was playing with them. He was not a guy I ever wanted to roster. He always would, you just pray he got an assist or two because he wasn't taking a shot. He was always a salary saver, but I think adding a guy like Braden Shen's into the mix is going to certainly help offensively. And then obviously we got to talk about Tarasenko. He's one of the best goal scorers in the league. He's one of maybe 3 or 4 guys that has the potential to put up a 50-goal season, and I think he will at some point in his career. Not necessarily going to say it's this year, but he's one of those fun players to watch and the guy that you always want to have on your team.
Yeah, definitely. So, Sean, how do you feel about Jake Allen? He was a big reason that they were able to eliminate the Wild last year in 5 games. Do you think he's going to be able to elevate to that during the regular season as well?
It's definitely possible. He's been fluky throughout his career, so he's a person that you're going to need to rely on the back end, and especially with Jay Bouwmeester getting up there in age, you're going to have a solid back end when you look at Jake Allen. So you're definitely going to have to hope that he can replicate the good and not the bad of Jake Allen of years past.
Yep, I would agree with that. So the last team we're going to talk about, guys, is the Winnipeg Jets. So they made a ton of changes in the offseason, kind of an attempt to move up in that Central Division. They just haven't been able to find a way in the Stanley Cup playoffs over the last couple of years. But they've got a lot of guys that are really interesting for fantasy, a lot of guys that put a lot of shots on goal. So who stands out as far as all these transactions, Sean? I think they've made a couple of big moves.
One of the ones they brought in when they sort of got blasted for is Dmitry Kulikov. They ended up bringing him in for 3 years on a $13 million contract, so about $4 1/3 million a year. The thing is with Kulikov is in the past he's actually been not bad. Last year, however, he was a complete disaster. So it depends what they get from him when he comes in, because if he comes in and can revert back to some of his Florida days, you could actually get a solid contributor. So it's going to be very dependent on him, because I think they're expecting him to come in, and based on the salary they're paying him, they want him to play some minutes and they want him to play a decent amount of minutes, and they're going to expect him to be in the top 4. So he's the biggest question mark for me for them because they're definitely expecting him to come in and contribute.
Yeah, definitely a polarizing type signing. They were criticized a bit, I know, when it first happened. So that's going to be interesting. Patrick Laine is someone that definitely had an impressive rookie season. I think if we're trying to compare him and someone like Austin Matthews, you might have thought that their roles might have reversed a bit last year. Laine is the typical shooter, but Austin Matthews ended up, I think, having quite a bit more goals and shots than him. So what are your thoughts on Laine, Ryan?
Yeah, Laine is a phenomenal talent. He's definitely one of those guys that's just got quick release, powerful shot. I mean, putting up 36 goals as a rookie is impressive in its own right. And before his injury, he might have ended up getting to 40 goals and leading the rookie class. But he kind of came back a little bit slow from his injury, and it really obviously hurt his offensive total. A guy I'm really interested to see this year, who I was really interested in last year, but he didn't really get much of an offensive role, was Kyle Connor. They didn't really give him much of a chance to succeed offensively and eventually just ended up sending him down. But if he can get a spot in the top 6 this season, I think he's a guy that could be a potential breakout for them this year.
Yeah, I think that's going to be something to watch. What about the goaltending, Sean? I think the combination kind of Hellebuyck and then they signed Steve Mason. Does that kind of stabilize things a bit in that?
Yeah, I mean, they've basically been looking for a goalie for years. So bringing in Steve Mason and signing him to a 2-year, $8 million deal is something that they're going to hope will solidify the back. The problem is the issues for them come in front. You watch a guy like Dustin Byfuglien play, and he gets skated by like a turnstile, and Toby Enstrom's not a defensive-minded player, and Tyler Myers has struggled to some extent. So it's a situation where they're going to expect Steve Mason to come in and right the ship, but they still have guys, and they re-signed Connor Hellebuyck and signed him to like a $2.5 million deal. When I see that signing, I'm not completely sold on the fact that Steve Mason is going to be the full-time starter all year because they are still trying to pay Connor Hellebuyck to be there as the backup. So it's definitely a situation they're hoping that it can right everything and fix everything. But in order for that to happen, you definitely need the guys in front of that to help as well.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if Hellebuyck still ends up being the guy for a good majority of this season. So before we jump into who we think is going to win the division, do you have anything left on this team, Ryan?
No, not particularly. I mean, Mark Scheifele said he wants to be mentioned in the same breath as Connor McDavid and Sidney Crosby, so he's kind of put some high standards on himself for this season. He had a great year last year with 82 points. I mean, if he can take even a small step forward and get closer to 90, I'm not saying he's in that same breath, but the argument will be there. Like he'll at least be in the tier right below.
Yeah, that's going to be one to watch for sure. So Central Division, you guys got to start last time, so I'll throw my pick out there. I think the Minnesota Wild, not to be a homer, but I think that they've got some of the most depth in the league. I think that their playoff performance last year, they kind of just ran into a hot goaltender. I still think they have a lot of talent and a good chance to take this division. Sean, who do you think is going to take it?
I'm actually going to go a bit out on a limb here, and I'm going to say Winnipeg's going to win it. I think they've been primed for the last couple years to be in a good situation to perform, and I think maybe this is the year that they finally put things together because all of these young guys that are really good players like Mark Scheifele, Patrick Laine, Nikolai Ehlers, all have another year under their belt. They're coming in. They've all played together for a while, and there isn't much changeover at the top end of their roster. So I just have a feeling that they're going to put everything together and at least minimum make the playoffs and maybe even surprise everyone and win the division.
Yeah, I don't know if that's as much on a limb as you think. I think what you just said makes a lot of sense. So I think that they could definitely challenge for it. Ryan, what about you?
I'm also going to go out on a limb and say the Dallas Stars. I really like the hiring of Ken Hitchcock. I think he's going to help their defensive woes a lot. 2 years ago, they were extremely successful, just outscoring their opponents with Niemi and Lettinen both putting up a .905 and .906 save percentage. I think Bishop, with the size of goaltender that he is and the defensive system that Hitchcock's going to bring in, I think he'll thrive as well. And we all know the offensive punch that they have, and I really think they could win the division.
All right. Well, I think we can go ahead and end it there for the Central Division, guys. If you aren't already following Sean on Twitter, you can do so at PSU Fans 2. Ryan is at Dongshow DFS, and you can find myself at Joe Holka. Thanks for hanging out with us. We'll be back with the Pacific Division preview, so stay tuned for that.